Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Burbusel. I run our manufacturing vertical here at HSO. I've been in the ERP space for many years, over 30 years. So, but I'm very glad to be able to welcome you to this webinar. I'm joined by a couple of very highly experienced colleagues, James Devonshire from the manufacturer, who has authored the report, and also Fhaheen Khan, who's a senior economist with Make UK. So with all of that said, I'm now going to hand over to James, and he will take over from here.
Thanks, Matt. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all hear me okay. Okay, so topics for discussion today. We've gone through the welcome and the introduction. I'm going to cover some recent, rather big news from UK government when it comes to manufacturing. Then we're going to have a look at the results of the manufacturing agility assessment before having a roundtable discussion towards the end. Big recent UK manufacturing news. It doesn't always happen, but it's been a really busy week for UK manufacturing. The biggest news of the last 7 days is the UK government's advanced manufacturing plan, which is supported by £4.5 billion for industry, including £3 billion for automotive and aerospace between 2025 and 2030. The government's also confirmed permanent full expensing to boost confidence among manufacturers when it comes to investing, something that Make UK and its members have been calling for some time. We also saw the release of the UK battery strategy, a blueprint designed to facilitate growth of a domestic battery industry, including a globally competitive battery supply chain by 2030. The government says a successful UK battery industry will be a significant driver of economic growth, supporting up to 100,000 jobs by 2040. Furthermore, it was also announced this week that the Made Smarter adoption programme will be expanded to all 9 English regions in 2025 to 2026, before working with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland from 2026 to 2027. This news means hundreds of thousands more SME manufacturers will get access to technology advice, leadership and skills training, as well as grant funding for digital internships and technology projects. Finally, the other big news this week is Nissan confirmed it is charging ahead with its vision for a zero emissions future, announcing that all 3 models made at its UK plant in Sunderland will go 100% electric. The latest investment includes up to £1.1 billion into its UK operations and wider supply chain for R&D and manufacturing. This is great news for Nissan, its 7,000 UK employees and the 30,000 jobs supported in the wider UK supply chain. All of these stories and more are available in full on the manufacturer website, themanufacturer.com. Matt, Fhaheen, I don't know if you've got any comments on probably one of the biggest weeks that I can certainly remember in UK manufacturing.
Yes, just to comment on some of those points. Yeah, it's probably one of the biggest weeks I've ever seen. I've ever seen for manufacturing as well. I mean, we at Make UK have been fighting for expensing for I can't remember how long. I mean, capital allowances in general, and it's I think whilst capital allowances, some businesses might not necessarily agree with whether or not that's going to be the defining factor that's going to turbocharge investment. It is a big deal in terms of the tactics that government are deploying in terms of how they're viewing and starting to maybe finally understand investment process in manufacturing, where they don't just invest in 2-year cycles, 3-year cycles. Actually, manufacturers invest planning for long-term, 10 years, 15 years ahead of time. And so this makes a big deal. And I think it's worth noting that what this changes our perception of from the outside view of how other countries are going to look at the UK from now on. I mean, we were, in terms of how generous we treat capital, plant and machinery in tax treatment, the 30th worst country in the OECD. So out of 36, we ranked 30th just before 2020. And now we're going to jump up to being in the top 5. And so that's a big deal. So it's a very positive transition for us.
Yeah, and I think, you know, wholeheartedly agree with everything that Fhaheen's just said. But it's that confidence thing, I think, now that we're seeing. I was at a smart manufacturing conference last week in Liverpool, and some of these announcements had already been made. But the feeling with manufacturers there was, you know, just how good news this was for the sector. And I think, you know, just the level of confidence that it's going to give people to invest going forwards is going to make a massive difference.
Yeah, totally agree, Matt and Fhaheen. Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to go on to the manufacturing agility assessment. This is a original report researched and produced by us at the manufacturer, commissioned by HSO, your business transformation partner with deep industry expertise and global reach. The aim of the report, or the survey behind it, was to discover more about manufacturers' agility and gauge the current sentiment among organizations. It's based on the results of an online survey conducted between June and July 2023. We then added further context by doing some follow-up interviews with people who filled the survey out. Because it's all very well interpreting data, but actually speaking with manufacturers who responded is invaluable from our point of view. Okay, so this is the methodology. You can see there. We've got a pretty decent cross-section this year of industry verticals represented, maybe a little bit heavy on aerospace and construction, but a good selection nonetheless. Also worthy of note is the significant proportion of SMEs who responded this year, 49%. So meaning smaller companies, small manufacturing organizations were definitely represented. In 2022, SMEs accounted for just 35% of respondents. Okay, so let's move on to some of the key findings this year. Now we're going to go through just some of the findings in this year's report. So if you want to find out more and get all of the insights, you're going to have to download it. We will supply a link, I'm sure, at some point. So here are some of the key findings represented visually for you to have a very quick look at. But we're going to elaborate on a handful of them now, as I just said. Okay, so this year, 56% of manufacturers believe they are extremely or highly agile. This compares to just 47% in 2022. Meanwhile, 57% of manufacturers said their agility gains are being boosted by improved internal data collection, sharing, and analysis. A senior manufacturing leader told us during our follow-up interviews that thanks to their digital transformation initiatives, whereas previously it would have been extremely difficult to move a method of manufacture from one facility to another, they're now seeing operations being moved across borders with much less effort and time, adding to those all-important agility gains. Moreover, our interviews also uncovered that manufacturers are realizing that by being agile and diversifying, they can potentially win more work and orders, whether that's through new product development or slightly altering a current offering to appeal to a wider customer base. And as at least 3 senior manufacturing leaders told us during our follow-up interviews, rather than just focusing on a standard range of products, they're seeing manufacturers diversify their offerings to stand a better chance of winning that next order, and that requires you to be agile. However, as it says there, 53% of manufacturers say they've been significantly or highly impacted when it comes to sourcing raw materials and components from suppliers. This compares to 69% in 2022 and 75% in 2021. Perhaps no real surprises there given the circumstances in 2021 and 2022, but 66% this year have still diversified their suppliers, while 59% have stockpiled inventory as a result. Now, the problem, though, is that increased inventories are hamstringing many manufacturers' agility efforts. As one senior leader told us, we're carrying more inventory because of fragile supply chains and uncertainty with lead times. But this is a double-edged sword in terms of agility. On the one hand, you can better respond to changing customer demand and supply chain instability. But on the other, it means tying up more working capital, reducing warehouse efficiency, and running the risk of increased inventory obsolescence. I don't know if Matt and Fhaheen, you've got anything to comment at all on this first slide?
I think it's quite interesting in terms of the agility as well. Improvement in comparison to 2022 suggests that manufacturers are obviously perhaps developing process. Maybe they're getting used to working in a very topsy-turvy environment and it's becoming harder to shake them. I mean, they have been obviously, as we know, firefighting back-to-back crises, from uncertainty from about leaving the EU, I think in 2019, followed by a pandemic, then followed by an energy crisis. It's just a lot to take. So it's good to see that more than half are actually I guess growing in that scenario, despite and not necessarily been falling or tripping over it.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective, the customers that we've worked with, we certainly saw in 2022 a huge amount of effort from manufacturers in investing in systems replacement and projects, which has tailed off in 2023. And I think that is, it's a heart of, just as Fhaheen was saying there, with some of the the energy cost crisis, as well as the ongoing supply chain challenges that still do exist. And tying up that working capital has slowed things down, but it is good to see that the manufacturers are viewing themselves as being more agile. And I think that's off the back of, as I say, the investment made in 2022, and also the willingness to still continue to invest, even though making those decisions is probably taking longer, purely because you've got to make sure that you've got the funding right and the ability to run a project correctly.
Okay, so here are just some visual representations of what we've just covered. We've already spoken about these, so if you can move to the next slide, Debbie. Okay, so this year, 66% of manufacturers have accelerated their investment plans in people, products, premises, and processes to mitigate recent world events. So some positive sentiment from manufacturers, as Matt just highlighted, highlighting how they are still investing despite the turbulence we've seen in recent times. So some positive news there. However, only 36% of manufacturers say they're extremely or highly agile when it comes to recruiting and retaining staff. It's something we hear at the manufacturer all the time when we speak to manufacturers of all shapes and sizes. Recruitment and retention still a big Achilles heel at the moment for manufacturing organizations. And actually recruiting and retaining the right staff is the #1 obstacle between manufacturers and their goals. We'll look at some of the goals a little bit later. But as we learned during our interviews, the big focus now is retaining staff first and recruiting second. So we've heard about initiatives like hybrid working where possible, increased technology adoption, and simply making work more interesting are keys for manufacturers to retaining the good staff that they need. Indeed, as one senior manufacturing leader told us, the key they found to overcoming current recruitment challenges and the skills shortage is to hang on to the people they value the most in the first instance. Now, one thing the results do suggest, which is positive, is that we're seeing an improved situation for SME manufacturers, given their large proportional representation this year. And SME manufacturers are companies who typically struggle with recruitment more so than their larger counterparts. And as one leader told us, one of the ways they're making work more interesting and fulfilling is by taking an iterative approach when it comes to data, from understanding first what is important and then looking at how to visualize it in the most intuitive way so the people who can actually benefit from it have it where and when they need it. So we're seeing some real employee empowerment at work, and it highlights how digital transformation initiatives are driving data-led decision making and making people's jobs basically more interesting. Matt, Fhaheen, anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just gets back to what I was saying just before. That willingness to invest is still there, and I think some of the challenges, as you've just highlighted on the recruitment side of things, but cash flow is obviously a major concern for manufacturers. We've seen declining order volumes this year, particularly in the second and third quarters. And that obviously has a knock-on impact in terms of cash flow. So there are still some fairly strong headwinds. Fhaheen, I don't know if you wanted to add to your thoughts to that.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to just pick up on the recruitment and retaining. I think that's really, really important, especially now. And we certainly see that at the height of the labor shortage crisis, we could call it, in official statistics, there was around, I think, between 90,000 and 100,000 vacancies that was publicly vacant across manufacturing, which at Make UK we estimate was costing the industry around £21 million a day in lost potential output if they had been able to fill those jobs, and that resulted in I mean, we talked quite a lot about, we've seen a lot of information or data around how input costs were changing almost by the hour. So if you were trying to buy raw materials from your suppliers, if you weren't accepting the price on the spot, then 30 minutes later you'd get a new price quoted, because that's how quickly things were changing. We were seeing the same thing with salaries, that businesses were struggling to retain their workers because the manufacturer next door was willing to offer slightly more the same skill set because there's such a shortage. So how manufacturers deal with that is going to impact their growth expectations in 2024. We have seen some of those labor shortages ease a little bit because the activity, as Matt just said, orders are slowing down. So we're seeing a little bit of a slowdown, but that remains an issue. And whenever we ask questions, why don't you digitalize? Why don't you go through decarbonization? Why don't you do supply chain resilience? It always goes back to the same thing. We don't have the people to do it.
Yeah, and that's certainly, both what Matt and Fhaheen have both said, certainly something we hear all the time from talking manufacturers. Yeah, it all rings true there. So here's some more visual representations of the results we've already mentioned. Not really much to discuss there. This is what we've already talked about. Likewise here, mitigation strategies. As I mentioned earlier, more than half manufacturers are struggling to source raw materials and components. Some of the strategies organizations executed to mitigate, as I said, 66% have diversified their suppliers, 66% have accelerated investment positively, and a couple of other key findings there. 6% have entered new regions and territories, and as we mentioned, precautionary stockpiling of inventory as well. Okay, so business goals manufacturers are working towards over the next 12 to 24 months, certainly the ones that they told us about during the survey. Sustainability, no surprises there. Customer relationships and increased investment. Again, that positive sentiment we're seeing and hearing. Now, bear in mind, this survey and subsequent interviews were months before the government's advanced manufacturing plan was announced. So it begs the question of what impact that will have on manufacturers' outlook going forward. Matt, Fhaheen, what do you think?
Yeah, this is very interesting. I found this one quite good to see, especially the number one on becoming environmentally sustainable. And Make UK, we've done an immense amount of research on net zero and the roadmap to decarbonization. And of course, when we ask businesses, why are you doing that? Often they say it's a good business decision. It's about energy cost savings. It's particularly after the energy crisis. It has become the return on investment on technologies like solar panels and wind farms have sort of significantly reduced in time. So it takes less time to get the payback period. The second thing that we've started to see that the morality of or the ethics of why businesses are doing this. We've started introducing options in our own survey questions of it's the right thing to do, and actually the second biggest reason manufacturers are doing and sustainability and circular economies and all these things is because it's the right thing to do. They have kids. Many of them even have grandkids, and they often refer to those family members saying, I've got kids, I've got grandkids. We have to become sustainable. We have to become energy efficient. And actually, these sort of ethical reasons are actually becoming higher priority for manufacturers now today as well. But of course, it needs to make a cost sense too in the first place.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing is the challenge of helping manufacturers on that journey of sustainability. How do you get started? A lot of our manufacturing customers have made some core improvements within their own operational areas, but it's obviously working with your partners to find out what are they doing, and how do you get the supply chain sustainability information, start to track and report on that, which has been driven by legislation that's come out in the EU, legislation to be announced later this year from the UK government. And I think what we're starting to see now, a lot of why manufacturers are doing it, just as Fhaheen said, it's about doing the right thing, and playing your part in caring for the planet. But also the fact is that legislation and government policy is driving these changes. So the circular economy is being driven by the fact that there are EU regulations in place now that say, well, you build a product and it's got to be able to be repairable. Those sorts of changes are starting to have an impact in terms of how products are being designed for the future.
Yeah, and actually, just to follow up on what Fhaheen said then about sustainability, it also boosts a business's attractiveness, both from a customer point of view and a potential talent point of view. We've heard from several manufacturers where they've been interviewing people for jobs, and the interviewee has actually turned the question around on the person doing the interview and said, tell me about your sustainability credentials. What are you doing in terms when it comes to sustainability? So it's actually for manufacturers as well to kind of highlight their sustainability initiatives to attract the right talent as well. Okay, so main obstacles to achieving some of the goals we've just looked at. As we mentioned, manufacturers are still struggling, unfortunately, with recruitment. It's the number one obstacle in the way of them achieving their goals, followed by global economic conditions and cash flow, perhaps those inflated inventories rearing their head again. Changing customer focus. I just touched on it then, actually, about making yourself more attractive to customers. We're also seeing a big change in customer focus from manufacturers, typically B2B companies, obviously, who are now realizing the value of engagement and continuous customer interactions. One senior manufacturer told us that they're really focusing on e-commerce now and how it can help their customers enjoy a better experience when doing business with them. Not many industrial B2B companies have such offerings in place, but they want theirs customers to have the same levels of visibility, traceability, and tracking when they order from them as they do when ordering from their favorite online retailer. Matt, Fhaheen, anything you've heard recently about e-commerce in B2B manufacturing?
Yeah, it's certainly the impact in changing directions has definitely been seen, and it sort of comes across in different ways, as you say. You know, an e-commerce, a website platform, yeah, that's an obvious thing, but also investing in things such as customer service, field service as well, and being able to just work much more closely with your customers. Manufacturers who previously would have sold, you know, via a wholesaler wouldn't see their end customer, but now that is definitely changing. Fhaheen?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a whole lot on B2B, but I think there's some interesting stories that we got from our own members quite recently as well. It's a relatively old family business in the Northwest who said that they sort of lost quite a lot of their order books throughout the second half of last year. And then they listed their business on Amazon and became a business selling on Amazon. And they found that their order books tripled, and their turnover increased, and it was interesting because they couldn't necessarily see who their customers were all the time, and it could have been individual people or businesses buying from them directly through their warehouses, and it showed like a real testament that it wasn't that challenging for them to take that step, once they just explored it and maybe had a conversation with Amazon. And Amazon is one example. There are obviously other platforms you can go on. Sometimes it's often to think like actually the investment that's really required is the time and the research, not necessarily the financial cost involved, which is what they really needed to do. So, I think it's quite interesting to see this data on the increased focus on that.
So finally, these are manufacturers' top digital transformation goals for the next 12 months. So lots of data focused stuff here. 62% of manufacturers looking to automate admin processes, 55% want to drive data-led decision making, and 51% want to automate physical processes. So again, a large efficiency focus here. And as one senior manufacturer told us, they've seen that where they can harness and fully utilize data, their productivity increases exponentially, as too does their quality, resulting in less rework. So not just efficiency gains to be had, but potentially increased sustainability credentials due to less waste too. So back to that all important sustainability again. Matt, Fhaheen, anything on this last slide?
Yeah, I mean, this is where for us the rubber hits the road as a business transformation organization, and we're seeing a lot of system replacement that's going on, which is driving the automation of the admin processes, but also the fact of automating transactions across disparate platforms as well. There's also a huge focus now on making better use of data, particularly around procurement. We're seeing lots of workloads in that area, where again, manufacturers that are working in different jurisdictions, they haven't got a centralized procurement process in place, but they're looking to find ways to be more effective and efficient in the procurement processes. So having the data in order to manage that is critical for them. So that's typically where we're seeing most of the changes for us. Fhaheen, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add to that.
Just very quickly, I'm not surprised that the manufacturers are trying to automate admin. I think manufacturers, from my experience, are pretty much allergic to admin. They absolutely hate it. And then there's exactly the thing they do, especially when you're thinking of trade, customs, paperwork, especially since our exit from the EU has been, the worst, the biggest determinant or barrier to trade. I think it's very interesting in terms of the journey to kind of automation and robotics. I think those sort of technologies perhaps starting to penetrate households at the moment, and so we're more experiencing it now. But actually, manufacturers have been embracing automation for decades now already. I think the challenges and perhaps the rollout of Made Smarter is going to accelerate this. Is that for many businesses, what we see is that it's very difficult to automate retrospectively or retrospective processes. So once you've already got you can't necessarily automate one proportion of your process and not automate the rest of it because you introduce new bottlenecks and that sort of thing. And what we find is that actually it's very difficult for small companies in particular to experiment with robotics because they have to be able to design an entire process back to front and introduce automation for the whole thing rather than to replace parts of it. So we do see that there are still some challenges, although there's a huge awareness and willingness to automate. There are barriers to getting in that way that still get in the way for particularly small companies.
Yeah, totally agree, Fhaheen. We hear it all the time from manufacturers. They want to do digital transformation. They're being told that they should be doing it, but the question always comes back to they've got so many legacy systems and so many kind of ingrained processes, they don't know where to start. So yeah, I think the rollout of Made Smarter nationally will certainly be a massive thing for SMEs, at least going forward. So that concludes a kind of whistle stop tour of the key findings from this year's agility assessment.